Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, January 11th, 2025. We begin with our dear sister, Luyanda Kaboka, bringing us the African Drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, our very own author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, Dr. Gerald Horne, will be joined on the line by Oliver Rosales, professor of history at Bakersfield College and author of the book Civil Rights in Bakersfield, Segregation and Multiracial Activism in the Central Valley. Then, we're going to be sending you a relay from Prison Radio with a message from soldier and revolutionary behind the walls of empire, Baba Mumia Abu Jamal. Finally, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Shan Gallagher, assistant professor of history at Colorado Mesa University and author of a forthcoming book focused on the enslaved Africans owned by state governments during the 1776 revolt against the British Empire. It's all right here, so be sure to stay tuned. Now I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Wiz Khalifa sampling Johnson Hawkins, Tatum and Durr, George Benson, Donald Byrd, Joe Henderson, Monty Alexander, and Bobby Hutcherson. Now people get ready for this train a-comin', taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Oliver Rosales.
Alafia. This is Sister Luyanda Kobaka with Freedom Now's weekly African drumbeat historical calendar with significant dates, events, and personalities in the struggle for a just society and an egalitarian world. January 12, 1977. The 1949 Geneva Convention on the Rules of War is signed, giving guerrillas the same rights as uniformed soldiers in war. January 13, 1971. 6,000 workers strike against the settler colonial rule in Windhoek, Namibia. January 14, 1960. The United Nations General Assembly adopts the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. January 15, 1929. Gamal Abdel Nasser, the first leader of an independent Egypt, was born. Nasser, a revolutionary nationalist, struggled to defend Egypt's liberation from the neo-colonial forces of the United States, Britain, and Israel's efforts to throw back on the shackles of economic colonialism, as well as to unite with other newly liberated African countries. January 15, 1929. Dr. Martin Luther King was born. Dr. King, a principled freedom fighter, took up the call of the oppressed and sacrificed his life for the liberation of African people in particular, and all humanity in general, from racism, economic exploitation, and imperialist wars. January 15, 1890, Sitting Bull. Sioux resistance leader and staunch opponent to compromise with the Euro-American settler government was assassinated by Indian police in the payroll of the United States government. January 15, 1871. Rosa Luxemburg, a great woman revolutionary socialist, was born in Poland. Her activism was centered in Germany, where she gave life to the Marxist theory in the concrete effort to reorganize Germany and all of Europe under a non-exploitative system where workers' and women's rights would be the center of societal development rather than the capitalist class. January 16, 1966. First conference of the Organization of Africa, Asian, and Latin America, the so-called Third World, met in Havana, Cuba, building the non-aligned movement to provide assistance diplomatically, economically, etc., for the remaining vestiges of colonialism throughout the world. January 17, 1961. The CIA and its local puppets murder Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected leader of the Congo. January 17, 1979. The Iranian people overthrew the US CIA stooge, the Shah of Iran. January 17, 1942. Muhammad Ali, world heavyweight boxing champion, was born. Muhammad Ali is best known as an outspoken militant against US imperialism in Vietnam and against the oppression of African peoples in the United States. January 18, 1959. The Lumber Indians defeated the Ku Klux Klan in the battle near Morton, North Carolina in 1958. This has been Sister Luyanda. For any comments, please contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. This has been KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara. And in the language of our people in South Africa, we leave you and we say, Amandla!
Away to.
Amandla!
Away to.
Amandla!
Away to.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Oliver Rosales, Professor of History at Bakersfield College and author of the book Civil Rights in Bakersfield, Segregation and Multiracial Activism in the Central Valley. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Oliver Rosales.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here in this space with you and to discuss this book.
Well, thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
So my family's from Bakersfield. They migrated north from Mexico about a century ago as traqueros, railroad workers. And my family grew up in a segregated area within Southeast Bakersfield that was sort of adjacent to the city proper. And I always had an interest in history, but never quite saw myself in history. And, as I sort of matriculated through, education systems and, I encountered professors that moved me, that inspired me. My first love was colonial North American history. I liked New England, but, I could never imagine myself doing, research in that area. And so as I sort of, sat back and learned how to be a historian, I saw on the ground in Bakersfield in the early 21st century, the kind of shuttering of some of the legacies of the Chicano civil rights movement happening around me. And that got me interested in researching, the origins of the Chicano movement in Bakersfield. And through that process, what I came to realize is it was connected to all of these other multiracial activist struggles that involved coalition building, work in the war on poverty, and of course, the impact of the farm worker movement. And there was a common kind of enemy, a villain in the story, which was the legacies of racial segregation in the city that I grew up in that shaped my family's experiences going back to the origins of the city. So that's the origins of the book. That's why I did it, really, was to kind of see myself in history. And then also, the students that I teach. I've been at Bakersfield College for a decade, and there's a real dearth, a lack of scholarship related to this critical region within Central California. So that was the impetus to getting this book done.
So I take it that there is a Black community in Bakersfield. How big is it, and what role does it play in your pages?
It's a wonderful question. The African-American history community presence in Bakersfield is significant and perhaps much more significant than its numbers. I think historically, the Black community in Bakersfield probably stands around maybe 5 to 7%, give or take. And it's always been on the periphery. It's always been on the city's margins. The city boundary lines were drawn oftentimes to exclude the Black community. And so it's been like that for quite some time. I mean, it goes back to, for example, the story of Allensworth, right, which is in Tulare County, just sort of northeast or northwest of Bakersfield, this sort of Black freedom town. And, a lot of folks who were living in Southeast Bakersfield, Black folks, they sold their property in Southeast Bakersfield and they moved to Allensworth. And we're there, during the early part of the 20th century while that Black community was sort of thriving, but it experienced problems, particularly with water and such. And thereafter, the Black community kind of, dissipated both back into Kern and also Tulare County. But in the work that I do, I think it's the struggles of the NAACP, the ministers' associations that kind of set the groundwork for challenging racial segregation. And then, as the 20th century unfolds, you have a lot of Mexican immigration and community groups that emerge trying to organize that community. And so the heart of the story in some ways is how Black and brown folks built coalitions to become part of the city proper and to challenge legacies of segregation. Even though I sort of consider myself a Chicano historian, somebody who's studying the Mexican-American civil rights experience, it's absolutely been connected to the Black freedom struggle and the folks who've been doing work on the ground for almost a century now. The Black community, like I said, its numbers might be small, but it's had a pretty large influence in the course of civil rights in the Central Valley.
So how far is Bakersfield from Los Angeles? And to what degree did the latter city influence the former city and vice versa?
So Bakersfield is about 100 miles north of Los Angeles. It's on the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. It's sort of known for, again, the story of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, as well as, its contributions to what's called the Bakersfield sound. This is, country music, Buck Owens, Merle Haggard and such. And so in some ways, Bakersfield culturally has had an influence in California, sort of being known for its Southern Gothic stereotypes, maybe a backwater of progressive California. But during, I think, the civil rights era, the farm worker movement, not only the United Farm Workers, but the farm worker struggles that go back to the 1930s and in the 1940s, they had a large influence on California's labor movement in trying to expand labor rights to farm workers excluded from the New Deal provisions. So, and that's really what makes, Cesar Chavez significant nationally, and the Filipinos and the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, because they were able to get those union contracts and eventually get, California to pass farm labor legislation in the 1970s. So I think when we think about that larger story of agricultural labor struggle, that has both sort of statewide and national influence. But what my work specifically looks at is the coalitions that kind of built, maybe in some ways because of the failures of the labor movements of the 30s and 40s, and how organizers are sort of positioning themselves to go into doing other kinds of sort of grassroots work within the urban core. But then also as the United Farm Worker movement accelerates in the 60s and 70s, the coalitions that build around that and are galvanized to challenge, segregation well beyond the fields. And then, of course, folks came to Delano to support the movement from the Bay Area, from Los Angeles. I remember this has been the mid 60s, right around the time the Great Boycotts were launched in the 1968. The LA City Council, LA Black politicians were supporting the United Farm Workers and would come and volunteer their time. And so, going to Delano, which is about 30 miles north of Bakersfield, was a transformational experience for a lot of folks, a lot of people of color. And I think, especially regionally in Central California, those stories are lost. The United Farm Worker Archive is in Detroit, Michigan. I had to travel all across the United States to do the archival research for this because it's just really not on the ground locally, aside from, people's garages and doing oral history. So it was really a labor of love and try to create an archive, a social justice archive that I can kind of donate back to the people. So that's, again, I think Delano, Bakersfield, Central California has had a lot of national and statewide influence, and it's always been a kind of a beacon of organizational hope in some ways, even for folks, again, in Los Angeles.
So you mentioned the labor organizing in Bakersfield in the 1930s. And if I'm not mistaken, Dorothy Ray Healy, who was a leader of the Communist Party, was involved in some of that organizing, and she eventually becomes head of the Communist Party of Southern California. Was there an impact of the Red Scare, the anti-communist uprising post-1945? Did it have significant impact on labor organizing in Bakersfield?
I think the short answer is yes. And that's sort of where my story picks up in some ways, where like after World War II, when, racial liberals, I look at, for example, the civic unity movement. Mark Brilliant at UC Berkeley writes about the statewide civic unity movement, which was trying to kind of expand the scope of the New Deal to tackle issues of segregation and civil rights that sort of fell short in the 30s. But that was heavily influenced, as you say, by anti-communist politics and red baiting. So some of the organizations that I look at, for lack of a better word, might be called maybe more mainstream kind of liberal organizations that are promoting American citizenship. But that's very much part of just 1950s culture. And so what I'm trying to do is look at the legacies of the work that they actually did in championing civil rights reform and tackling, racial segregation. And again, it's also coalitions. And so, there's aspects of ideological diversity that I'm looking at. But when you talked earlier about, radical politics, it's the Central Valley. So, there's always been a sort of, valley-crat phenomenon when we talk about the left or the Democratic Party, is that they're still having to operate in a particular context. And so the Central Valley is a unique space. It is, again, red California. But I do also look at political transformation. So, for example, I look at the war on poverty. There used to be a kind of Democratic left pro-union aspect to voters, even in the white working class in the Central Valley, but some of that starts to shift, obviously, in the 1960s. In part, what I look at one of my chapters because of the war on poverty and, grant money that came into the National Farm Workers Association. And this is happening at the same time that the grape strike is unfolding. And so, it kind of causes this taxpayer revolt on the political right or among conservatives to kind of switch their affiliation from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. So yeah, but I think most of my narrative story is kind of picking up after World War II, when some of that, as you say, red baiting and anti-communist politics has succeeded in, kind of purging the valley of some of that organizing effort in the fields.
What about police brutality? Does it play a role in your story?
It does. There's been some actually very interesting work done on police violence, both among the Bakersfield Police Department and the Kern County Sheriffs. From The Guardian, the British newspaper, Colin Kaepernick came out recently with a documentary called Killing County on, disproportionate deaths for people of color in Kern County. And I think that's all wonderful work. It's very 21st century. In my book, which really looks at like the late 40s through the 1980s, there are some incidents of police brutality that I recount that were galvanizing to civil rights activists. One was this sort of race riot that happened in 1969 at a place called Fraternal Hall in Southeast Bakersfield. And the fascinating thing about this story, you had, police sort of lining up outside this dance hall and going in and, beating kids over the head. It was sort of connected to larger conversations about war on poverty funding and, using taxpayer resources to kind of promote youth activities within the region. And a lot of this narrative that I'm getting about a backlash from, police and characterizing Black youth as being rebellious came from some of the white organizers who were witness to this, as well as police officers. So I recount in the book the story of the son of a former police chief named Steve Powers, who has since passed on, but was a member of the police force that participated in this raid at Fraternal Hall in Southeast Bakersfield. And he was going to give his report about the incidents that happened. And what he found is that, they were basically manufacturing a story, and he didn't want to report, this manufactured story. He wanted to say what he really witnessed. Long story short is he winds up quitting the force and testifying against them in some of the court proceedings that happened thereafter. And it was a really powerful story. And then him and his father, the former chief of police of Bakersfield, going back to the 1930s and 40s, then become harassed by the police as being, turncoats and such. And there's this wonderful quote that I put in the book about, Robert Powers, the father, saying that, Bakersfield was this sociologically backward racist community. And this was in the front page of the Fresno Bee, which is, 100 miles north of Bakersfield. But again, it became a galvanizing force, I think, for activist groups to highlight, police misconduct. And the story makes sense within the larger book because, if you go back a few chapters within the book, I look at the origins, the progress of racial segregation within that area and tensions between, the city council and, the voters within the city in that particular region. And again, that's why I had this chapter on the war on poverty, because it became this polarizing thing, if you will, between, voters and activist groups who sort of had faith, in working with governments, whether it's, federal government giving the money or the county and state with implementing the funding about what those things could actually do for a disfranchised kind of, community on the margins. So yeah, I do recount some examples of police misconduct and how it became a galvanizing force for civil rights. And my hope is that it gives some kind of, history to some of the more recent attention that's being brought to police brutality in Kern County and Bakersfield.
Finally, Professor Rosales, author of the book Civil Rights in Bakersfield, Anything else to add about Filipino labor, Asia Pacific labor more generally, indigenous labor, for example?
Yeah, I think I hope my book underscores that there's a lot of work that needs to be done by historians in the area. There's been some real wonderful focus on Filipino American contributions to the farm worker movement. I'm thinking, AB 123, which is mandating that Filipino contributions to the farm worker movement are taught at the fourth grade level. I've done a lot of public history work with the Filipino community, recognizing the contributions of the Manong generation from the 30s and 40s. But a lot of that work is outside the scope of my book, because my book is really kind of story of racial segregation within urban Bakersfield, where there just wasn't a very predominant Filipino community in Southeast Bakersfield. But I hope my book brings up larger conversations about kind of urban history that needs to be developed in the Central Valley. So for example, the University of California, Merced, a lot of their historians and scholars there are taking graduate students who are doing work on the Central Valley, because the Central Valley in some ways, is kind of a frontier of California when it comes to academic study, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And you mentioned indigenous communities as well. That's one of the stories that's not included in the book, right? It's the book kind of picks off with the development of the city, but it doesn't, talk about the displacements of Native American peoples that certainly happened in the 19th century. But again, as an academic, you only have so many words that the publisher will publish. But again, it's one of the few, if only, books that deals with race in the city of Bakersfield, which is a community of 400,000 people. That's outside of country music or dealing explicitly with like the leadership of the United Farm Workers. So the goal of this book was to try to tell the story of ordinary activists, ordinary people, ordinary organizations that again have been championing civil rights reform for decades, and to encourage the activists who are on the ground doing environmental justice, immigrant rights, that their activism doesn't emerge in a vacuum, that it has a genealogy.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Rosales, author of the book Civil Rights in Bakersfield. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Dr. Horne, for having me.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is her sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
Welcome back here on Freedom Now. We now send you over to Prison Radio for a message from none other than Mumia Abu Jamal. After that, you'll be right back here on KPFK for an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Shan Gallagher.
A mad dash to the right. As we look at this world, as New Year dawns, we must admit that the world is on the march. And if we're honest, it's a march to the right. Why is this so? It is so, in my view, because rightist politicians have mastered the art of fear. And the politics of immigration is all about the manipulation of that fear for political purposes. Fear moves us, not hope, nor altruism, for fear taps into our survival instincts. It also draws us to the polling places and makes us vote. That explains what has been happening in Europe and in the U.S. as well. In fact, the recent American election was a contest between love and fear. And guess what? Fear won. In his first inaugural address in March of 1933, former U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Well, that was then, 1933, almost a century ago. Today, fear breeds more fear. And fear of what? Fear of blacks, smart women, fear of trans people. Politicians who know about how to motivate populations know well the pull and power of deep emotions, like fear. They use it the way a violinist uses his strings. Many people are so engaged in fear of the other that they don't really see the game behind the curtain. That's because fear disrupts our ability to analyze and think things all the way through. Much of this anti-immigrant hysteria is occurring in Europe, as many refugees from former colonies are trying to make their way back to the lands of the former colonizers' countries. In the U.S., much of the anti-immigrant energy is aimed at Mexicans and other Latino communities. Some see this explosion of anxiety as the fear of a browning of America. Latinos constitute the fastest growing segment of the U.S. population. Europe, meanwhile, is anxious about Arab and African refugees. Remember the lies about Haitians? They're eating our dogs, they're eating our cats, and other pets. Remember that? Of course you do. It was a lie. But it made Haitians the object of fear. How many folks know that the Haitians helped Americans fight against the British in the Revolutionary War? The Haitians were otherized, thus easier to fear. A few weeks ago, I heard a radio broadcast of someone complaining about refugees entering their country, with significant anger in his voice. Guess who the speaker was? He was a Turkish citizen complaining about refugees from the civil war in Syria. This shows that the problems are not always as simple as they seem. Over a century ago, Marx said that a worker had no nation, and neither did the working class. As members of a class, all workers were brothers and sisters of other workers. Then they had 2 world wars, the awesome carnage of those wars, and people were firmly held in the grip of nationalism, still in war mode, but this time locked in a so-called Cold War. The wars had severely weakened several European empires, and during the 60s, we saw a wave of anti-colonial struggles with many countries winning independence. The Algerian Revolution erupted in North Africa, and France, already weakened by its fall at Dien Bien Phu, or Vietnam, lost Algiers after some 6 years of anti-colonial war and popular resistance. Algerian revolutionary Frantz Fanon called repeatedly for decolonization, not just in Algeria, but in the whole of Africa. In fact, the world must be decolonized. Now, as many of those Arab and African states experiencing flag independence, a term that really means false independence, and those countries being in the grips of neocolonialism, their populations were uncared for and had to flee to find new places to live. With governments failing to serve the needs of their people, they became refugees of states that failed. The capital accumulation that Europe has experienced looked pretty damn attractive to millions of people in the former colonies. This present era is not just one of rightist drift. It's also a time of neoliberalism and the domination of the market. It's not a coincidence that these three features are merging together. For rightist drift, also known as neoliberalism, and anti-immigrationist anxieties go hand in hand. We are not surprised. Markets don't work to make communities better. They work for profit, period. They work to exploit, not to serve. We need to know that so we can organize together against it. Refugees aren't our enemies. Only our fears are. And fear ain't nothing but an emotion. Danke, danke sehr. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Shan Gallagher, Assistant Professor of History at Colorado Mesa University, and author of a forthcoming book on enslaved owned by state governments during the 1776 revolt against the British Empire. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Shan Gallagher.
Thank you, Dr. Horne.
Thank you for joining us. So, what does this project concern, and how did you stumble onto this topic?
Thank you. Yeah, so my forthcoming book, Slavery's Revolution, is about enslaved people's experiences of state ownership and public labor during the American Revolution. We're very familiar, or most people are very familiar now, with the story of the Black Loyalists, those enslaved who ran to the British for their freedom during the American Revolution. Less studied is essentially the recaptured Black Loyalists and the enslaved people who never had the opportunity to make an attempt for their freedom during the Revolution. In fact, as slavery started to kind of collapse through revolt and marriage in 75 and 76, Patriot Committees of Safety, soon to be replaced by proper state governments, began to arrest enslaved people off abandoned plantations and also to arrest, of course, Black loyalists that they recaptured in battle. And state governments generally took these essentially seized enslaved people and sent them to backcountry public works, really as a carceral measure. And there, whether it's Black loyalists recaptured at the Battle of Great Bridge in Virginia who were sent to the Chiswell lead mines, or it's enslaved people on the abandoned plantation of Thomas McKnight. After Thomas McKnight flees to the British, the North Carolina Provincial Convention confiscates his slaves and sends them to a backcountry ironworks. In all of these different ways, what patriot governments begin to do is to use Black labor to essentially power their own revolution. And these originally incarcerated enslaved populations are then kind of met with and have added to their number enslaved people that are just simply confiscated by loyalists as the states start to pass confiscation acts. And they use these state-owned slaves in every conceivable form of public labor. You can find them in Virginia's state naval shipyards. You can find them in South Carolina being sent to Continental Army camps to dig ditches and fortified camps. You can even find them acting as domestic servants in the houses of patriot officers. And I argue that, in fact, the ways in which all of these state governments, these patriot institutions turned state governments, find themselves becoming slaveholders outright, reveals essentially the pro-slavery nature of the American Revolution. That, in fact, while historians have often focused on kind of the ideological anti-slavery in certain founding fathers' writings, or they'll point to the legislative side of the state that looks at essentially different state governments tooling with liberalizing manumission or at least debating the idea of gradual emancipation. In fact, if you look at the administrative and the military sides of the state governments during the American Revolution, you see how kind of very quickly these state governments are committing themselves to the defense of slavery through the creation of systems of public slavery. Sometimes this could be very direct. So for instance, when confiscated slaves in South Carolina are used to fortify a Continental Army fort that is itself used as a checkpoint to try to recapture slaves attempting to flee to the British, that's directly using Black labor to combat Black freedom. And so my book is essentially about the ways in which processes of confiscation, imprisonment, and impressment of enslaved people creates a kind of powerful pro-slavery energy over the course of the Revolutionary War.
So what percentage of the enslaved were ultimately controlled by the state as opposed to individual slaveholders?
That's a really good question. And that's one that's kind of hard to figure out. And those are numbers I'm still currently trying to kind of work through. Confiscation lists of slaves, let alone lists of enslaved prisoners, that is like recaptured Black loyalists, the evidence is quite spotty. But we can say this, looking particularly at the experiences of impressed slaves. So these wouldn't be slaves necessarily owned by state governments, but slaves that are temporarily seized by, say, the Continental Army or state militia, and then used for public works, used to work in military camps, all of these other things. It would have been very difficult for enslaved people, particularly in the war-ridden regions of like the American Low Country. It would have been very almost inconceivable for enslaved people to not have experienced impressment at some point during the Revolutionary War, particularly in the Low Country. And so numbers for actual state ownership, confiscation, those are numbers I'm trying to figure out. But we can definitely say that they were in the thousands, right? If you calculate the numbers of loyalist slaveholders who were confiscated during the Revolution, the number of recaptured Black loyalists, the number has to be in the thousands.
Was there evidence of resistance by these enslaved Africans during this time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So at all of these sites of backcountry public labor that confiscated or incarcerated enslaved people are sent to, whether it's Chiswell lead mines, the Chatham iron furnace, the different kind of public works in and around Richmond in Virginia, you always see evidence of enslaved people escaping trying to run away. You see also evidence of them essentially pushing back against their superintendents, like demanding greater provisions and things like that. One of the more notable instances of resistance that I look at in the book is essentially the ways in which enslaved public laborers aid Benedict Arnold's raid on Richmond during the Revolution. Benedict Arnold, having switched sides to the British, takes part in the Virginia campaign by raiding the Patriot capital of Richmond, and including the public works there in and around. And essentially all the enslaved public laborers that can assist him in this. And patriots themselves write about this, that enslaved public laborers flee in mass to Benedict Arnold's camp, that they're burning down like powder magazines and things like that. And so in this way, enslaved public laborers could themselves become some of the most radical and most militant of Black loyalists. And so we see moments like this throughout the world.
So you say they were working in mines. What other kinds of labor were they doing? Were they building roads? Were they building bridges, for example?
Yeah, so a lot of it is essentially like road work, right? So this is an 18th century war, which means it's fought with wagons. It means it requires hauling artillery. So a lot of what impressed and confiscated enslaved people are doing is essentially doing what was called pioneering work, clearing paths through swamps, building roads, entrenching, all of this kind of work. And then at the state level, all the states are interested in using enslaved people to produce munitions, right? So the Chiswell lead mine is one of the most important sources of musket shot that the Continental Army has. And so recaptured Black loyalists are literally putting ammunition into the satchels of Continental soldiers. They're also used in a lot of naval works. To build Navy ships is not just, it requires not just kind of different forms of carpentry. You need a lot of rope making to make kind of rigging and things like this. And so many of the kind of state naval shipyards depended on confiscated enslaved people to perform that labor. So essentially, every form of military labor imaginable, including acting as officer servants, was being performed by these either confiscated, impressed, or incarcerated enslaved people.
So I understand your work has implications for the legal term refugee. How so?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely, right. So the refugee is still an emerging legal concept in the late 18th century. It had some history in the 18th century as a term for religious mobility, right? So Protestants, so Catholics fleeing Protestant nations and Protestants fleeing Catholic nations and receiving asylum in other kingdoms. But it's really in the age of revolutions that the refugee as a secular term begins to develop. And while many historians of refugees focus on the refugees of the French and Haitian revolutions as kind of that original kind of group of kind of people seeking asylum on the basis of political persecution, increasingly Black loyalists need to be understood as really in some ways the first modern refugees, right? Their birth certificates to move to Canada are in fact some of the first kind of papers made for stateless peoples. And I argue that that we need to also look at kind of the ways that the Patriot governments persecuted enslaved people during the Revolution as aiding their case for refuge with the British Army, right? So for instance, when Black loyalists in occupied Charleston, South Carolina, are pleading with British military officers to be evacuated from the United States, they famously say that they are obnoxious, quote, both to their masters and to the state, right? And so the ways in which enslaved people are, when they're talking to the British about why they should be evacuated at the end of the war, they're not just talking about their experiences of enslavement in general, but they're talking about the ways in which their activities during the war make it inevitable that they're going to be brutally punished and even executed by the United States, right? And therefore should be resettled on that basis. That means that really Black loyalists are some of the first people in the late 18th century to begin developing arguments of non-refoulement, that you can't send me back to a place where I will be, where I can reasonably expect to be kind of politically punished, right? And that they're developing this idea of kind of that their very quest for freedom itself has kind of exposed them to forms of political persecution. And then in particular, sorry, I'll end on this. In particular, state-owned or enslaved people who in some ways had experiences laboring for the Patriot state have particularly strong claims to refuge with the British, right? So for instance, Benedict Arnold in that aforementioned raid early on after the raid is kind of toying with the idea of returning some of these runaway slaves to their individual slaveholders, because it's a kind of hearts and minds campaign, and he wants to keep Virginia's slaveholders on his side. But he says that he can't return any slaves that are essentially like useful to the Patriots, right? Slaves owned by anyone who held arms or office for the Patriots is the language he used, which would then include enslaved people who were used in public labor. So in this ways, often enslaved people who are fleeing Patriot public works have like the strongest claims of asylum. And so in some ways, they're kind of the vanguard of these Black loyalist communities who are starting to flesh out arguments of kind of presenting their slavery as a form of political persecution and demanding that the British offer them evacuation and resettlement on that basis.
So, in other words, in order to gain asylum in the United States and many countries today, oftentimes it's useful to present a claim of a well-founded fear of persecution if you are returned to the country from which you're fleeing. And you're suggesting, I take it, that the Africans who were fleeing the clutches of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, etc., because they sided with London, they sided with the British, they had a well-founded fear of persecution if they were not allowed to leave the United States, which many of them did, as we know, for Canada, for London itself, and of course, ultimately to West Africa, Sierra Leone.
Yes, absolutely. And the dangers to them for fleeing are not hypothetical, right? Like, recaptured Black loyalists are executed, right? If not sent to some of these public works. Recaptured enslaved people are sold away from their families, right? In the later stages of the war, the Continental Army camps across the South are essentially these detention centers in which like they're temporarily holding all these recaptured slaves while states, their previous owners, and all these other people try to kind of sort out claims to them. And often these attempted runaways would be severely punished, right? And so it's not even hypothetical that their lives are in danger should they have been kind of abandoned by the British.
Mm-hmm. To what extent, if at all, do the indigenous fit into your story, Shan Gallagher?
So that is where it requires a bit of kind of nuance, I would say, in the sense that indigenous nations could be allies of Black attempts to make their freedom, particularly in the Low Country, right? Some enslaved freedom seekers do find refuge, support, or assistance from the Creek and the emerging Seminole nations. But also, at the end of the American Revolution, some of the kind of the first goals of both like the Georgia state government, and then also after the Constitutional Convention, the new federal republic itself, some of the first kind of diplomatic goals that the U.S. has with the Creeks in particular, is for them to return all those Black freedom seekers that are now held by them. Some as free people, some as slaves, and they're still as slaves only now to these indigenous in these indigenous communities, right? And so the indigenous nations in kind of the southeast of the United States face tremendous pressure on the part of the United States to return all these enslaved people who had run to them. The British in East Florida, though the British will be out of East Florida after the war, after it takes them a couple years to evacuate. So it's essentially a kind of rump government for the British in East Florida. Also place some pressure on these indigenous nations on that regard. And so indigenous people figure into this as a kind of third force that the U.S. is trying to kind of make into forced to play the diplomatic position of kind of slave catcher in the Southeast. And so many enslaved people ultimately do get returned from these indigenous nations back into slavery, though many are also aided by these indigenous nations in their quest for freedom. So it's a little bit of a complicated story.
Complicated story indeed, Shan Gallagher. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Author of a forthcoming book on the 1776 revolt in North America and the role of enslaved Africans. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Dr. Horne.
When you find the girl you love has gone, you have to stop while that must go on. You beg the Lord about someone, but deep inside you pray, oh, he'll bring a man someday.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Oliver Rosales from Bakersfield College, as well as Shan Gallagher from Colorado Mesa University. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to Sister Luyana Kaboko on the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar, as well as our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Baba Didan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org and scroll down to find Freedom Now, so you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.